Over the course of 5 years, this respected city hospital delivered thousands of babies. Most survived, but 40 newborns never made it home. For years, no one questioned why the same explanation kept appearing, or why the parents were never shown their child's body. At first glance, the records looked routine. Different doctors, different days, different outcomes. But when the files were compared, the same detail was missing every time. There was no confirmation the babies had actually died, because no physician's pronouncement and time of death was ever recorded. In a hospital this respected, that omission wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. I'm Detective Cassandra Maddox. I expose the truths others would rather keep buried. This is one of those truths. There were 40 dead babies, 40 grieving families, and beyond the pain they would never forget, there was one detail nearly every parent remembered. The midwife. They called her an angel. She was calm, kind, and gentle. The one who held their hand when things went wrong. The one who spoke softly when they were told their baby didn't survive. Some parents said she even called weeks later to check on them to see how they were holding up. To them, she was the light in the darkest moment of their lives. It took time to notice what connected the cases she appeared in. She wasn't present at every delivery. She appeared almost exclusively when something went wrong. Emergency deliveries, unexpected complications. Situations where the room filled quickly and attention was divided, where one team focused on the mother, another prepared to move the baby. In those moments, she became the calm center of the room. She lifted the newborn, reassured the parents, the one who said the baby needed to be taken for evaluation. And in case after case, that was the last time the parents ever saw their child. So, who was she? Her name was Elena Ward. For nearly 2 decades, she'd worked labor and delivery at the hospital. She was there long enough to be trusted, long enough to be familiar, and long enough that no one questioned her presence when things went wrong. Each time a baby went missing, she didn't do it in secret. She followed procedure, just not all the way to the end. She logged the baby for evaluation, marked the transfer, and then diverted it before intake was completed. From there, the paper trail went quiet, and within hours, a death was recorded without a pronouncement, without a physician's signature, and without a time of death. On paper, the child was gone. In reality, Elena had simply moved them into someone else's custody. They weren't smuggled out in the middle of the night or moved through back hallways. Elena transferred them into what was discovered to be temporary neonatal custody, a short-term placement used when a baby is surrendered, abandoned, or left without a legal guardian. By the time the paperwork caught up, the parents had already been told their baby was dead. And once that happened, no one was looking for a child who officially no longer existed. When the inconsistencies were finally flagged, Elena was brought in for questioning. Why were babies being transferred without intake records? Why were death files closed without a time of death? And why did she appear at the center of so many of those cases? When she answered the questions, she wasn't in a panic or deny being there. She didn't even seem surprised. She said the babies were unstable, that they needed evaluation, and that in emergency situations, paperwork sometimes lagged behind care. She stated that she never pronounced a death and never signed a certificate, and that part was true. When asked about the missing time of death entries, Elena didn't argue. She simply said those decisions were made after the baby left her hands. Once I handed them off, she told them, they weren't mine anymore. And that was the problem. If the moment when the baby disappeared from view wasn't recorded, then nothing that happened after it could ever be proven. When I began a deep dive into the investigation, I followed the transfer codes from the agency and noticed that the paperwork's language changed very quickly, sometimes overnight. Interim placement became private placement. Pending review became finalized. And then the word appeared: adoption. Not months later, not years. Days. It was discovered that babies declared dead inside the hospital were being placed alive through a private adoption pipeline almost immediately after they disappeared. That was the moment the investigation stopped being about negligence and started being about intent, because babies who die don't get adopted. It later turned out that this adoption agency wasn't hidden. The agency itself seemed legitimate. It was licensed and well spoken of, the kind of place no one questioned because it looked like a place meant to help. Its offices sat 3 miles from the hospital. It wasn't even discreet. Same city, same donors, same board events listed in local charity pages, and at the top of the agency's filings was a name well known across many hospital boards: a hospital administrator, someone whose job was oversight, the man responsible for compliance, for partnerships, and for approving external programs exactly like this one. The agency had been marketed as philanthropic, a solution for abandoned infants, a bridge between crisis and care. But the timing told the real story. Every baby placed through the agency matched a hospital death. Every adoption finalized days after a delivery gone wrong. Every file was clean because the child had never officially lived. The person in charge of the hospital fed them into an agency that he owned. And once I understood that, another truth surfaced. The babies weren't taken at random. Every child funneled into the agency shared the same quiet vulnerabilities. Mothers who arrived alone, mothers who were sedated during delivery, births where the father wasn't listed, or families without advocates or extended support. That was where Thomas Mackenzie came in. As the hospital's director, Thomas never entered a delivery room. Part of his job entailed that he work in risk assessments and liability, so he knew which cases would generate scrutiny and which would dissolve without resistance. When expectant mothers came in, Elena flagged those deliveries with a subtle notation or mark in the chart only someone watching for would notice. From there, Thomas took over. His agency classified the infants as a high risk of abandonment, a designation that required no consent. Elena controlled the moment the baby left the room, and Thomas controlled everything that followed: the paperwork and the placement. So where did the babies go? They went to unsuspecting wealthy couples who had spent years on adoption lists. Couples with spotless backgrounds were desperate and willing to pay a large sum for a child. Thomas Mackenzie's agency marketed itself as a solution for abandoned infants, a fast, ethical alternative for cases that couldn't wait, and it came at a price. Families were charged between $120,000 and $200,000 per placement. It wasn't framed as payment for a child, but as expedited processing fees, legal services, medical care, and private placement coordination. Thomas and Elena would then split that cost and pocket it. The families were told the same story every time. The baby had been surrendered at birth, the mother didn't want contact, and there would be no records and no future claims. What they didn't know was that the child they were holding had been declared dead just days earlier, that somewhere in the same city, another family was still grieving, believing there was nothing left to find. All of the babies had no birth certificates, no death certificates with times, and no paper trail connecting them backward. What finally exposed Elena and Thomas's scheme was an unbelievable revelation. One of the adopted children was seriously ill and needed a stem cell transplant. By the time he was 4, doctors confirmed what they'd feared from the beginning. His condition wasn't just rare, it was inherited. The kind of disorder that doesn't respond to conventional treatment. Without a transplant, he wouldn't survive childhood. The odds of finding a compatible donor outside the family were devastatingly low. The adoptive parents were told to register him anyway, not because it was hopeful, but because it was protocol. Weeks passed, then months. Then unexpectedly, the registry flagged a match, not a partial, but a near-perfect HLA match. HLA is short for human leukocyte antigen, the genetic fingerprint doctors use to see whether a body will accept someone else's cells. The donor profile was anonymous, as always, but the details raised quiet alarms. The donor was a woman in her mid-30s, registered locally, with a long history of donations related to the same condition. She hadn't joined recently, but had been donating for years. The transplant team didn't say anything to the parents at first. They focused on the surgery and saving the child's life. The transplant worked. And afterward, one of the physicians did what doctors do when something doesn't make sense. They looked again. The statistical likelihood of that match, combined with the donor's medical history, crossed from rare into nearly impossible. The hospital requested permission from the registry to contact the donor only to ask one question. Would she consent to limited medical disclosure? She agreed. No names, no identities, just context. During the mediated conversation, the physician asked routine questions. Family medical history, previous pregnancies, any children with known conditions. The woman paused, then said something no one in the room was prepared for. She said she had a son who would be about 4 now, but he died right after he was born. Silence filled the room. No one said the word adoption. No one said mistake. But the doctor already knew what the math was saying, because the chances of a biological mother unknowingly donating life-saving cells to the child she believed she had lost weren't just unlikely. They were singular. Once the transplant team reviewed the woman's labor history, they expected to find some record that explained why her child was never part of the medical system beyond that day. A birth record, a complication, a documented cause of death, anything. Instead, they found nothing. No record that this child ever existed. The physicians flagged it as a potential error and submitted a formal request for a review of the hospital the woman gave birth. At first, the assumption was simple. A one-off failure, a tragic clerical mistake buried under years of archived records. Soon, an audit was launched. Not of the woman's case alone, but of every birth that occurred around the time she had delivered. Investigators pulled neonatal death records from the same unit, spanning the same years. They weren't looking for a crime. They were looking for confirmation that this was an isolated oversight. Instead, they found echoes of this case. More files ended the same way. More deaths without times. More charts missing the same final steps. Within days, investigators identified the common thread behind the missing records. The midwife. Later, after questioning her again, they understood the connection between the administrator and the adoption agency. What had taken years to hide took only weeks to unravel once the right question had been asked. Arrests followed quickly. Elena Ward and Thomas Hale were taken into custody and charged. Both pleaded not guilty, but were ordered held pending trial. Under state mandate, hospital administrators were required to notify every family affected by the audit. Mothers and fathers who had been told their babies died were contacted and informed that their cases were under criminal investigation. Some were told their child may never have died at all. At the same time, a separate task force began tracing the adoptions. Files were reopened. Placements were reviewed. adoptive parents were contacted, many for the first time since finalization, and told that the origins of their children were now in question. For some families, the call came as disbelief. For others, as terror. For many, as a truth they weren't sure they wanted to survive. The hospital issued public statements, apologies, promises of cooperation. But behind closed doors, the damage was already done. Lives that had been built on certainty were suddenly suspended in doubt. Grief that had once felt final was reopened, and then came the question no court was prepared to answer. What happens to the children? Do you return them to the parents who lost them, who grieved them, and lived for years believing they were gone? Or do you leave them with the families who raised them, who loved them, protected them, and never knew a crime had placed that child in their arms? There was no option without damage, no choice that didn't create another victim, because the law could decide custody, but it couldn't decide belonging. If you're still here, you're one of the curious ones. Stick around. The next mystery's already waiting.